A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we will cover aspirations and migration studies. We will focus on the concept of aspirations. In recent years, aspirations have emerged as a distinct area of study within migration. And this is also known as the aspirations turn. This aspirations turn in migration studies or the study of aspirations has created a new body of literature, and it's a new and emerging body of conceptual literature and empirical literature. And here the work of Jürgen Carling is the most important, and this lecture is primarily based on Carling's paper on the roles of aspiration and migration, Carling's work with Francis Collins on aspirations and the desires of migration, and Hinde-Haas's work on aspirations and capabilities. If you are interested in reading the original research on which the lecture is based, the references are listed on the last slide of this presentation. So, Carling and Collins in their 2018 paper bring to our attention that aspiration and desire are common terms in migration scholarship, although neither has been subject to much of explicit theorizing. Now, simply put, you will understand that aspirations are shorthand for what migrants want. And while there might be some overlap in the words aspiration and desire, they also open up distinct conceptual possibilities for migration theory according to Carling and Collins. But for this, we need to first reflect on how the two words have been applied to migration. So, Carling and Collins argue that if we were to consider migration as a question of human subjects' actual or potential mobility, then aspiration and desire are in simple terms relevant to three types of relation. The first one is a subject's relation to migration possibilities. The second one is a subject's relation to potential transformations in the context of migration. And the third one is an others relation to mobile or potentially mobile subjects. Now, the first case of a subject's relation to migration possibilities could be an example of someone who's planning to migrate, who's interested in migrating, desires to migrate, aspires to migrate, right? The second case, where a subject's relation to potential transformations in the context of migration is also one where the subject is typically a migrant, or it could be someone who is not a migrant but affected or transformed by migration. The third case, an others relation to mobile or potentially mobile subjects, is interesting. A simple example of this could be those left behind or affected by migration. So, in male migration streams, when men migrate, women, children, elderly are left behind. What is their relation to that mobile subject? Similarly, when students migrate, some of you in the course may be student migrants, but how does it affect those around you, your family, your parents, those who don't migrate? Carling and Collins highlight the last points as others. And others relation to mobile or potentially mobile subjects could take various forms, including a state. They use the example of a country, Singapore, that desires foreign talent. Thus, the defining element of this relation is the converse of the first 2 points. Those who migrate can also be objects of desire or aspiration. So, the first point here, a subject's relation to migration possibilities is most often conceptualized as migration aspiration. This is probably the most established term for describing the conviction that leaving would be better than staying. Other terms in this context are migration desires, wishes and preferences, and these are all subsumed under migration aspiration. Thus, the term migration aspiration is used in two distinct ways. First, as an umbrella category referring to wishes, preferences, desires, and second, as a more specific manifestation of thoughts and feelings about potential mobility. Carling's work also shows that migration aspirations can be seen through a two-step approach. Here, the first step is the formation of migration aspirations, while the second step is the realization of migration aspirations. Carling's work also shows, Carling also argues that aspirations are not the same as the intention, plan or wish. Now why is that? Because aspirations are more than that. The word aspiration marks an intersection of personal, collective and normative dimensions. You see, intention, plan, wish, these are all very personal or individual oriented concepts. Whereas aspiration also has collective and normative dimensions. Aspiration can thus be understood as the social grounding of individual desire. But this desire needs to be foregrounded in a context, in a social context, as a social force. And this is exactly what Carling and Collins do, and it's time now for us to elaborate on the social grounding of aspirations and desire. The fundamental point here is that individual attitudes toward migration cannot be divorced or separated from the social context in which they are located. Aspirations to migrate thus is not only about the transformative potential or an imagined transformation of an individual migrant, but it is also institutionally embedded, and there are also cultures of migration. So the notion of aspirations reflecting not only socially sanctioned behavior, but also social mechanisms of diffusion. People may observe their migratory achievements of their peers, come to see migration as a realistic prospect, and develop migration aspiration. So in this way, migration then becomes a part of the aspiration window of individuals. Individuals emulate aspirations. Emulative aspirations thus can be reinforced or even overshadowed by the cultural virtue of being someone who aspires. Now, the example of education aspirations is useful to understand how certain aspirations are perceived by the state vis-a-vis other aspirations, right? Now, let's look at the education aspirations of young girls. These are seen as an assertion of their identity and empowerment. They are seen as desirable by the state and by policymakers. Now, contrast these educational aspirations of young girls with migration aspirations, which have been greatly politicized by the state and by policymakers. Now, it's very interesting to note that in the 1980s and 90s, the dominant mood in countries of origin shifted from condemnation to celebration of migrants, right? And then emigrants became migrants as a role model and officially sanctioned driver of migration aspirations. Now, this shift that we saw, a shift of condemnation to celebration of immigrants in the 80s and 90s, this was really epitomized in Philippines. And so, the Filipino President Aquino, there was a famous and very controversial address to Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong, in which she referred to them as the new heroes of the Philippine economy. And so migrants were then celebrated as heroes, and now this message was delivered to people who had already migrated, and it disseminated an idea that becoming a migrant means becoming a hero. And the focus on the heroes of migration then also stipulates a desire realizable only outside of the nation, yet recognizable within its borders. This also brings us to the means and ends debate here. So, is migration a means to certain ends, or is migration an end in itself? And closely related to this, Carling also asks if migration is instrumental or does it have an intrinsic value? If it is instrumental, it means that it is an instrument for achieving another objective. Whereas if it is of intrinsic value, it means that it is valued for what it is as an end in itself. Now, Oliver Bakewell argues that people don't aspire to migrate. They aspire to something which migration may help achieve. So if we follow Bakewell and consider migration is something instrumental, that is a means to an end, then the nature of underlying aspirations is critical for migration theory. So in this case, therefore, the significant relation to study then is not between subjects and migration possibilities, but rather between subjects and their potential transformation through migration. So Carling argues that it is possible to undertake an integrated analysis of both migration aspirations and life aspirations. The two are not mutually exclusive. Both can play distinct roles in a coherent framework of connections between root causes of migration and outcomes of migration. So therefore, people's general aspirations in life can be important factors that directly or indirectly affect migration. For instance, these aspirations could be related to happiness, wealth, security, or family formation. Or Carling argues that the term migration aspirations could be used to describe the conviction that migration is desirable. Simply, Carling uses the term migration aspirations to describe the preference of migrating over staying, regardless of whatever the reasons might be. Now we come to the concept of aspirations and involuntary immobility. Now, drawing on his empirical research in Cape Verde, Carling developed the concept of involuntary mobility. Now, what do we mean by involuntary mobility? Carling argued that the defining feature of the migration order was not the magnitude or the complexity of mobility, but the prevalence of involuntary mobility. He calls this the combination of aspirations to migrate, but the inability to do so. So, involuntary immobility is when you have the aspirations to migrate and you are unable to do so. That is involuntary immobility. Thus, in theorizing migration, Carling became interested in not only the formation of migration aspirations, but also the consequences of persisting aspirations in the absence of migration. And this led him to develop a conceptual framework with three migratory categories of people. So, the first is, as you can see, migrants. Migrants are those who aspire to migrate and have the ability to do so. The next are the involuntary non-migrants. The involuntary non-migrants have migration aspirations but lack the ability to migrate. If they had the ability to migrate, then they would be migrants. And the third concept is that of the third category is that of voluntary non-migrants. Voluntary non-migrants have the ability to migrate, but they prefer non-migration to migration. So the voluntary non-migrants are people who choose to stay, the people who choose not to migrate even if they have the ability to do so. Now, aspirations to migrate can be analyzed at two fundamental levels. The first is the macro level and the second is the micro level. So, the macro level question of why a large number of people wish to emigrate, right? This is a fundamental question. This can be addressed with reference to the particular emigration environment, which encompasses social, economic and political context that is largely common to all members of the community. Now, a vital part of the emigration environment is that the nature of migration is a socially constructed project. Remember, migration is a socially constructed project. Now, people who consider migration as an option relate to it through meanings with which it is embedded. What about the micro level? Now, the second analytical approach to aspiration is the micro level question of who wants to migrate and who wants to stay. Here, individual characteristics such as gender, age, family migration history, social status, educational attainment, and personality traits are likely to provide some answers. These differentiating factors also include relations between individuals and that act to encourage or discourage migration. Exactly how individual level factors matter depends on the social context. And so therefore, Carling argues that explanations of aspiration therefore require attention to both the macro level and individual micro level influences. Another fundamental point which is made by Carling is that migration aspirations need to be seen in a continuum. So he argues that migration aspirations don't exist in binaries, in clear yeses and clear nos. In empirical exercises, that is, if you are doing a study to understand migration aspiration, some possible questions could be, and I am quoting, the first question that I am using is what Gallup normally asks. So Gallup asks, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country, or would you prefer to continue living in this country? Another question could be, would you like to live in country X? And yet another question could be, do you wish to emigrate? All of these questions refer to the concept of migration aspiration. Another approach or a second type of question has to do with intentions or plans. Now, as you can see in the figure, migration aspirations can be understood in a continuum. Now, the strength of the desire to migrate intersects with another dimension, which is the perceived realism of converting such desire into actual migration. This in turn depends on the characteristics of individuals. Example, their personality, resources, skills. It depends on their surroundings, which is their networks, family commitments, and the macrostructural context, which is immigration regulation, labor market opportunities at destination, and so on. Now, the question about intentions and plans reflect both the desire as well as the realism of migration. We now come to the effect of development on migration capabilities and aspirations. And this is something that Hein de Haas brings out in his 2019 paper on the paradoxes of migration and development. And so the question really is, what is the relationship between development on the one hand and aspirations and capabilities on the other? So, like I mentioned, Hein de Haas in a paper titled The Paradoxes of Migration and Development argues that the processes of economic and human development generally increase people's capabilities to migrate over greater distances, but do not automatically lead to migration. Now, what do we mean by that? So, this means that migration aspirations depend on people's more general life aspirations, as well as their perceptions of life here and life there, where they plan to migrate. Now, both are subjective and likely to change under the influence of broader processes of structural change. Now, these include improved access to information, images, lifestyle conveyed through education and media, all of which tend to broaden people's mental horizons, change perceptions of the good life, and increase material aspirations, according to de Haas. Now, if you look at the graph in front of you, you can see that development processes initially tend to increase both people's capabilities and aspirations to move, which explains why development often boosts migration, as you can see in the figure. Now, once sizable migrant communities have settled in destination areas, social networks tend to reduce the cost and the risks of migrating. And when this happens, this can further accelerate migration in established corridors, even if opportunities decline in destination regions. So, this part of social networks is something that we will cover in a later class. And as you can see, as societies become wealthier, beyond a certain tipping point, overall immigration aspirations are likely to decrease. And why is this? This is because people, as a society develops, as a country develops, as it progresses, more people can imagine a future within their own country, and while at the same time, immigration is also likely to increase. So having looked at what happens to capabilities and aspiration with development, we now come to De Haas's capabilities and aspirations framework, right? And this is a theoretical framework that conceptualizes migration as a function of people's capabilities and aspirations to migrate given certain sets of perceived geographical opportunity structures. So what De Haas does is he applies Amartya Sen's capabilities framework to migration, and migration is conceptualized as people's capability or freedom to choose where to live, including the option to stay. And now in turn, then he aims to theorize, just the way Carling did, ways in which macro-structural change can shape migrant aspirations and capabilities, and using this framework, he is coming up with new categories of human mobility. So you can see in the table on the screen draws on this capabilities aspiration framework, and what De Haas has done is he elaborates a theoretical categorization, and there are 5 ideal typical individual mobility types. So just to repeat, what's the definition of mobility? The definition of mobility in the capabilities aspiration framework is people's capability of freedom to choose where to live, including the option to stay. This categorization then also includes various forms of immobility, and so therefore it allows us to use both movement and non-movement within the same conceptual ambit, as so therefore mobility and immobility are 2 sides of the same coin, which is the freedom of mobility coin in the capabilities and aspirations framework. So what De Haas is really doing here is that he is building on Carling's concept of involuntary immobility that we saw earlier, right? And so now he is acknowledging a reality in which preferences, aspirations, capabilities are deeply affected by macro-structural factors, right? And therefore, when we talk of voluntariness in migration or voluntariness of mobility or immobility, it's only valid if there's a reasonable option to stay. Now, this doesn't mean that refugees and other groups of distressed migrants don't have agency. Of course they have agency, otherwise they would not have migrated in the first place. But their migration is forced to the extent that they've been deprived of mobility freedoms. They had no real option to remain, as that would have put them in serious danger of being persecuted, injured or murdered. So for refugees, migration is primarily a response to severe danger at home rather than a positive response to opportunities elsewhere. And De Haas argues that obviously once a decision to leave has been made, such opportunities will play a role in deciding how, when, where to go, and people will try to exert their agency as much as possible, although they cannot be conceptualized as the main reasons to migrate. So therefore, refugees are forced migrants because they didn't have the option to remain. Similarly, he says, and you look at the table there, migrants who are classified as voluntary return migrants by governments or by international organizations may only be willing to return not out of a real intrinsic desire to do so, but because they either have no access to social amenities and shelter, or they risk imprisonment, violence, other abuse, separation from their children in destination countries. Now, under such situations of extreme distress and pressure, migrants may eventually decide to return, be compelled to sign forms of consent for their voluntary repatriation, even if this is against their own intrinsic preferences or desires. So now therefore, from a theoretical perspective, we can classify this as involuntary mobility, even if such migrants are not literally forced to move, that is by violent means of deportation, they may under severe threat feel compelled to move even if this is strongly against their own desire. So, the categories of voluntary mobility and voluntary immobility only apply to people who have the capability to migrate, but also have a reasonable option to stay, with the term reasonable implying that this would not put them in dangerous or highly exploitative or life-threatening situations. The final category you can see is of people with low capabilities and aspirations to move. Now, how can we categorize a person who is living in poverty, who is neither able to migrate nor has ever imagined doing so? Now, based on the idea that capabilities affect aspirations, we may say that this person is deprived of the capability to aspire as well as the capability to move. And you can see how this makes sense. At extreme levels of poverty, migration rates are actually very, very low because people neither have the aspiration nor the capability to move. So then this raises the philosophical question as to what extent can we call this form of immobility voluntary. So therefore, the category of acquiescent immobility describes situations in which people are neither able to migrate and nor do they desire to do so. Because acquiescent implies the acceptance of constraints, and the Latin origins of the word mean to remain at rest. It is felt that this may be an appropriate term to desire to describe this mobility category. And however, Dehas argues that we clearly need to do more research on the formation of aspirations to move or to stay, and on the extent to which decisions can indeed be seen as acquiescent. Decisions to stay can indeed be seen as acquiescent. And now this brings us to the idea of spatial aspirations. Spatial aspirations formed by Carling and the triple constitution of migration. So, in his 2014 paper, Carling also uses the concept of spatial aspirations vis-a-vis migration aspirations. He argues that by making spatial aspirations the central concept, we allow for greater variation in how people engage with spatial parameters of their lives and their ambition. So, you can see the graph there, and it's very interesting and important to note that Carling differs from Dehans in that Carling conceives of the step from migration aspirations to actual migration a process and not the effect of a quality or ability or even capability. So, similarly, when people prefer to stay but are under pressure to leave, making it possible to remain is also a process of realizing aspiration. Now, this Carling calls the first of the three processes as the realization of spatial aspiration. Spatial aspirations can be said to exist in a way that ability cannot. And spatial aspirations are dynamic, they are malleable, they come into being through social practices and discourses, and this second process can be called the formation of spatial aspiration. Now, Carling argues that when spatial aspirations are not realized, it could be misleading to think of it simply as an absence of realization. Why is that? That's because in circumstances where people are prevented from being in the place where they would want to be, we might talk about repression or repression of spatial aspirations as a process. Now, such repression always implies that people are forced to be somewhere against their will. But this could either mean having migrated despite wanting to stay, or staying despite wanting to migrate. And then Carling goes on to say that by examining how spatial aspirations are formed, realized or repressed, we can advance our understanding of the interplay between individual agency and structural factors and better foresee the ebbs and flows of migration in the decades ahead. And so this brings me to the summary of what we've done in related to aspirations and migration studies. In this lecture, we covered the concept of aspirations in migration studies. We first looked at Carling and Collins' work on aspiration, desire, and the social grounding of aspiration and desire. We then looked at Carling's concept of involuntary immobility used to derive migratory categories and also the micro and macro level of aspiration. This was followed by looking at migration and aspiration as a continuum. We then looked at Hayendehase's work on aspirations and capability. We then followed by Carling's triple constitution of migration, looking migration aspirations as part of spatial aspirations. And if you're interested in reading the original research on which this lecture is based, the references are listed on the next slide. So here are the references, and thank you very much.